Okay, am I audible?
Yes,
Hello?
yes.
Okay. Thank you. If anyone wants to POI, please do so through the chat. Do not interrupt verbally. I'm going to be taking one from closing government. All right. I'm going to begin my speech in 3, 2, one. Obviously, in opposition, our mechanism is quite simple. We also want to punish these rioters, but we do not want to put any other mitigating factor aside from the other mitigating factors that might exist in current status quo in society. If you're an average reasonable person or an average person that do not have any like bounded freedom or whatever, then most likely we're still going to punish you as the same. I think that the case of opening government is quite uncomparative because insofar as this is something that you cannot necessarily quantify, for example, and OG never really mechanized as to why this is necessarily true, and they never really provided any kind of framework as to why this system actually provided mitigating factors. They only stated that there's already mitigating factors without actually analyzing the particular frameworks in that regard. We are already winning over OG. So I'm going to engage directly with those two, right? So two arguments under opening opposition. Firstly, what is the framework of mitigating factor to begin with? I'm going to have 4 layers on that. And secondly, I'm going to tell you why most likely this will actually create not mitigating factors, but actually proliferation of violence against minorities and other political groups, creating a more violent political system to begin with. So firstly, what is the framework that we can utilize mitigating factors, right? 4 things. Number 1, there must be a restriction of freedom. Number 2, there must be a reason as to why this particular person do not understand what they're doing. Thirdly, it must be inherently something that is directly tied with the inherently, factor in and of itself. And fourthly, this must be something that is done by everyone else and not only you as an individual. Firstly, the restriction of freedom, right? We think that the first framework in which mitigating factor is justifiable is there is a mitigation of freedom in regard to this individual person. That is to say, if you are bounded, for example, or if you are threatened by an external factor to literally kill someone, if you don't do it, they will literally kill your family, for example, then most likely that is a mitigating factor because law must be accurate to the point in which your individual agency must be the determining factor of whether or you're guilty, because when there is a lack of agency, then that action cannot be attributable to your natural individual self. This is obviously not comparable to the Capitol Riots, for example, in Germany, because even though Donald Trump actually maybe convinced you or like charismatically told you to actually go to the Capitol building, for example, he did not have any overarching power towards you. It is to say that Donald Trump did not have the power to punish you, or they do not have the power to actually, kill your family, for example, if you do not do the Capitol bomb, the Capitol Riot to begin with. Secondly, they must understand the point of the acceleration in them, right? The other framework of mitigating factor, if you do not understand what the action, what you are actually doing is, that is to say that if you're a crazy person, for example, is in there, of you are, or you're hypnotized or you're drugged by another person, for example, and you do a certain crime that is directed by another person, then there is something that is not necessary, then there is something that you cannot actually, calculate, for example, and there is something that you cannot necessarily get out of because you're influenced by an external factor. The difference between the influence of politician, though, is that the influence of politician is not absolute, because you still have your own calculus, for example, right? That is to say that if you're drugged or hypnotized, for example, you cannot think outside of that particular box because your brain is literally hijacked by a certain chemical or by a certain method, for example. But even if you hear Donald Trump's speech, for example, you can still figure out a way to get out of that influence, because you can still do things like research, for example. You can still do things such as counter narrative, for example, ladies and gentlemen. So they have an access to external counter narrative and counter information that makes them be able to break free of the individual influence to begin with. But thirdly, though, even if you do not buy those two things, and even if they're still influenced by Donald Trump, for example, and you still buy it as a mitigating factor, notice that the things that they did in the Capitol building in and of itself is not necessarily directed by Donald Trump, right? Exactly like OG said. OG said that Donald Trump only told people to actually, tell the White House, for example, that the election is wrong and there's systematic problems in the White House. But he did not tell you to literally kill people, for example. He did not tell you to actually destroy the White House, for example. He did not tell you to beat and trample people that are working in the White House and the Capitol building in and of itself. So the people in that particular regard already do these things out of their own agency and without any influence for Donald Trump itself, because this is something, these actions are not necessarily told to do by Donald Trump, right? So that's third thing. But fourthly, then, this The other mitigating factor of like mens rea is if your action is going to be the same as someone else. That is to say like this: if you're a doctor, for example, and if you suddenly poison someone, for example, the way that you determine a mitigating factor is to determine whether or another doctor or another person in that particular regard will also point the same poison, for example. Please shut your mind. So what happens here then is that when this particular person does the same thing with like another person in that same position, then they most likely will also get a mitigating factor. But in this case, it's untrue. Why? Because not all Republicans, right? Not all conservatives suddenly stormed the Capitol building when Donald Trump told them to do so, for example, right? That's to say that your action is most likely not comparable to another person individual action, meaning it's not a collective action that every single person will do. So most likely that can infer that you did this based on your own individual agency and not the influence of politicians. So based on those 4 frameworks, you cannot put this as a mitigating factor for these particular individuals. Practical then, why do you think this will actually incentivize and proliferate violence in the political system? Because exactly, right, the way that you determine the mens rea here is not necessarily comparative, because you cannot necessarily know whether or not this person actually do these things based on political reasoning or not, because the reasoning and the mens rea here is determined on your own opinion and not all based on objective factors. But before moving on, yes, CZ.
Don't you think it is the lack of agency of awareness because they are overwhelmed by the far right exposure, so that's why they are less likely to do those incentives that you said, right?
Again, the framework here is that simple, right? If you're a terrorist, for example, and you're influenced by terrorist views, for example, you're not necessarily pardoned by the state. You're also going to be jailed because this is not something of a metric, right? Usually, the metric of like robbing of agency is usually an objective robbing of that personal agency in and of itself. There is your drug, for example, or your hypnotized or whatever, or your physical agency is literally taken away from you. But subjective agency, in a sense of ideology, for example, is not a mitigating factor because that's not quantifiable and that cannot literally be translated to your own physical condition and your own physical agency, am I right? Exactly, this is moving on to the second point, right? You say you cannot determine whether or this person actually do these things because it's a subjective opinion, right? That's to say, if you're looking at the other mitigating factor, like you're bound, for example, or your family is being threatened, there is an objective mitigating factor because that's necessarily quantifiable. But the reason as to why OG cannot win this on the mechanism is because the way that you determine whether or your influence is on a subjective influence. That's to say, there might be a person that's influenced by Donald Trump and they did the Capitol Riot, and there might be a person that did not actually like get influenced, but they did the Capitol Riot anyway. The determining factor of that is whether or not you believe that they were influenced or not by their own word of mouth, because you cannot quantify people's opinions. This is bad for 2 reasons. On a micro scale, it justifies micro violence because violence against minorities, for example, can be justified by saying, oh, I was influenced by far-right politician, for example, and a far-right politician actually told me to actually kill minorities, for example, and that can be justified there. But secondly, violence against political opponents, for example, is more likely to happen because most of the people from a certain political group can just say that, hey, my politician has a rival, for example, and he really hates his rival, and I will go beat him up, for example. But on a macro scale, right, it's far worse because if in the future, if there's another Donald Trump 2.0, for example, and they enforce him to like do another Capitol Riot, it's going to be far worse because since there's a mitigating factor, people that are not even in line with the ideology can opt into it because they want to do violence, for example, and they can just use this particular excuse as them being influenced by another politician. And because all those reasons, we are very proud to oppose. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you for the very fine speech. To continue the case of government, I call Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
I wishing for miracle. Judah, are you here? Okay, Judah is not here. Sorry. Okay, so stop the.
Great. Yeah, I would gladly let the Orcom share the timer. It's like, yeah, if that's possible. Great. Okay. Three things you're gonna get in this speech. One, I'm gonna talk about framing. Second, I'm gonna talk about why this is an unjust ground for a mitigating factor. Lastly, how about weaponization of misconception, right? On framing, 2 things. One, Mens rea or intent and like the motive in doing something is always very hard to determine insofar as justice enforcers are not in possession of like memory or mind reading technology. And insofar as even the case of Jessica and Mirna, for example, we don't know why the former murdered the latter, even when the case was huge at that point. My point here is that Gov cannot just assert that intent can be found. That's why my POI to PM was very important. Because in criminal justice system, you need to consider some degree of practicability in the conceptions that you make. Let's evaluate what OG said. First, they said, oh, if you're following the politician, then you can be influenced. Well, then Pratt's challenge was so powerful because then it can be weaponized, right? You can just follow individuals and attribute the blame to them, saying that, oh, you know what, I'm influenced by these particular tweets. No responses whatsoever, and why the check and balances would exist. B, on exposure. Pratt's challenge also then became more powerful because in no way does exposure mean that someone will directly do something that is a particular crime. So unless God can come up with like similarly or like even more convincing method of why you can accurately determine intent, like their whole case falls. Second thing on framing, the debate is never about the capacity, complicity, or the negligence of the politician in making statements. This is because the politicians who probably are bad will still be punished accordingly, like according to their degree of imposed harm to the vast majority of people, based on the concept of witloken or the influencer concept in Indonesian or Dutch criminal justice system to punish both the influencer and the doer proportionally. And I thank Judah for pointing this out. So deterrence for politicians is uncomparative at best. This debate is exclusively talking about whether or not the actual rioters on the ground should be culpable and should be totally held liable for the crime that they did on the ground, right? And insofar as this framing answers the burden required by the motion, and insofar as the motion is phrased beautifully by the A court as such, the entire point from Gov arguing that the inflammatory statements as an experienced politicians are bad, their biggest principle is uncomparative, and that does not answer the burden of the motion. This doesn't even require imitation. On justification, right? Fred told you three really important things on justification, something that, is standing on his debate. First, on individual agency, and there's the non-existence of restriction. People, we think that people act out of their own agency without being totally influenced by like a certain coercive power to force you to do something without you actually wanting to do this. I think influence by politicians should not necessarily go to the extent of affecting individuals' agency in determining what actions you should take, fully knowing that it will be outlawed in the end of the day. And insofar as you still punish terrorists without reducing their sentences, surely this means that they should be punished accordingly, even under opposition. But I just want to reject Judah's illustration of abusive parents here, because there are levels of coercive power in that illustration, but more importantly, in that illustration, it's not mitigating factor, it's the principle of self-defense, which are definitely going unpunished because that's a natural response for a human being. For example, when you're faced with a certain threat, you will probably try to defend yourself by retaliating to that threat. So that principle is not comparative towards this debate. Fred also told you a very important explanation on agency, right? How do you determine something being influenced by agency or not? Something should be pardoned or mitigated if everyone in the same position would do the same particular thing given the same impulses. This is a very common conception in law about a reasonable person in a similar position in both public and private law, right? This means that we should not punish someone because they're practicing stuff from their natural instinct as a human being. What Fred told you was that insofar as not everyone does this, I think even OG considered that only 100 individuals that stormed the Capitol instead of the entire Trump supporter or sympathizer, which are millions, that's probably not a natural response that every human being would do in the same situation. So what we essentially prove to you here is that people are still acting out their agency. It's not a natural response. That probably people who do this still deserve to be punished, like without any mitigating factor or reducing sentence. The second thing that we told you was that there is a total awareness of the harm. When these individuals storm the Capitol and when they attack other government vital buildings, they know clearly what they do. They know clearly what they do is harmful, and the harm that they might inflict to these particular buildings, for example, to other individuals who probably are staying like near that particular building, right? So insofar as they are not totally blinded and they are still aware of the consequences that they probably inflict on other individuals, we posit that they should be like they do deserve mitigating factor. The last thing that we told you was that there is an extra action, right? Even if the storm as a whole can be connected to the tweet, the actions that people do on the ground, we're talking about looting, we're talking about punching regular working class who are working peacefully in the building. Those actions are done outside of the influence of the particular politician. What does this do, right? This negates the conception of vicarious liability that OG wanted to argue, because vicarious liability can only apply insofar as all the actions are dictated by the higher authority with coercive power, right? in this particular side of the house, we told you that one, there's no coercive power, but two, the actions that people do on the ground are outside of the particular influence by the specific things that are instructed by the politicians to begin with. So vicarious liability is also a big no. Why is this argument winning? Oh, you know what? I'm going to take closing first.
Let's take a look at the Hong Kong citizens who are forced to riot because they have to assure their government not to comply to China. Are you still not using this as their mitigation factors towards the riot?
Okay, first of all, that's probably uncomparative because it's unsure like why Chinese government would do anything like that. I think if your extension wants to play in only that specific instance, then probably that means that one, that still doesn't fulfill the principle of criminal justice system anyway, but two, that's a very marginally tiny range of benefit that I don't think like CG can win on the base of extension alone. Why is this argument winning then? Two reasons. A, this negates the principle of what should be a mitigating factor in court. We posit three principles constituting why something constitutes a mitigating factor in current law framework. But it's also completely deletes CG extension if they want to justify it using echo chamber because I've answered this already, right? But B, I agree with you that CO cannot extend on the benefit of deterrence or whatever and try to frame out this principle. This is because in determining whether or not we need to punish someone, the consideration is never to maximize utility, but criminal justice system is a retrospective mechanism that aims to correct the wrongs of the past first and look into the future. So even if CO to fully capitalize on practical, that's still significantly less important than what O has already proven. The last thing I want to talk about is the weaponization of this conception, right? What Fred told you was a survey that, oh, you know, this is going to be used against minority. People would then have a justification to weaponize this particular conception. For example, people can easily just follow or like the particular tweet for a specific, like, I don't know, xenophobic politician, for example, to use that to justify their action to reduce their sentencing in court. How do we systematically prevent this under opposition? Like, I think the most obvious answer is like, you know, we have more deterrence effect insofar as you will be punished with higher degree of punishment under opening opposition. That probably means that, you know, you are more discouraged to do this particular crime. But secondly, I think, you know, like the state does not probably legitimize what you're particularly doing in that situation. So we posit that, insofar as Gov tries to legitimize this by saying that, oh, you have a good reason for you to do this, that I think that will continuously continue the cycle of violence. So even if you want to play on the practical like consequences and the long-term impact, we're still winning under opening opposition.
All right, thank you for the very fine speech. To continue the debate, I call member of government here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, if you want to POI me, you could unmute, but please don't badger. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. 2 points of mechanisms before we jump into my contributions, right? First of all, we think like the prosecution of rioters will still undergoing to like proportionate towards the violence or how harmful the action that they did, right? Like, for example, you are destroying the public facilities, it's obviously going to like punish harder than you just contributing towards the riot, like only provoking the riots and so on and so forth, right? But the difference is that under ours, let's say that the about the mitigating sentence, right? You are still, for example, that you are destroying public facilities, you are going to still like punish for 3 years, for example, or maybe the moment like it is mitigated, you are going to like punish only like 2.5 years, and another half years you are going to be like going to like community service or social service, for example, that are not only like in the inside of the prisons or not only inside of the jails, because like the things that to mitigate your sentence is, for example, not necessarily your time or your quantity or how long you are stay in the prisons, but also the type of punishment that is given to you, right? So my contribution is about 2 things. First of all, I would like to explain to you why this is going to create a better rehabilitations under our words, and second of all, we are going to like prove to you why it's going to be very harmful towards the minority the moment like this proposal is not passed in the end of the day, right? But before that, I would like to rebut the opening opposition framework to matrix the mitigating factors, right? First of all, they say that it's going to be the first matrix is that when the freedoms is restricted in the very first place. But we believe that it's not like their freedom is restricted in the very first place, but what they know whether something it is right or not is restricted in the very first place, right? Because like as I told you that when these people is already like overwhelmed by the far right narrative, for example, so that's why the things that are justified under your words is that the far right things, for example, so that's why it is justified to follow the politician narrative to riots, for example. And as I told you that the fact that let's say they are forced to like has to do the riots because like it is deals with the freedoms, for example, like the citizens of Hong Kong, they has to pursue their own prime minister to not comply to China in the end of the day, or even let's say the terrorist itself. We think like it is not fair, right? When, for example, the terrorist itself are already dogmatized and indoctrinized from you a very child, for example, that the Sharia law is correct, for example, and we have to do anything, even to sacrifice yourself for your religions. It is something that are you perceive from the very child, and then like the moment you are already like adult, and then you are captured by the government, there is no mitigating sentence because like simply you don't have like any exposure that the other ideologies, and you are not dogmatized with another ideologies that you think is correct in the end of the day, right? So that's why we don't think like the restriction of freedom is going to be like the main matrix, right? Because they believe the ideology is subjective in the very first place. So that's why we think the law is also subjective, right? Because in the end of the day, that's something that are going to become the law is this the majority standard, right? Or the majority subjectivity. So how in the end of the day, the minority subjectivity could be accommodated under the opening opposition in the end of the day, right? But second of all, they don't understand what they are doing, right? Exactly. I think like they don't understand what they are actually doing, right? They don't know like, yes, they maybe know like the tangible harm, like they are destroying White House or they are destroying the capitals and so on. But like how this is actually impactful towards the country, they don't know like how much the severity that they do. What they want is to express the political expression that I would like to expand further in my extension later. Right now, moving on to my contributions, right? I would like to explain to you about why the process of rehabilitation is going to be much better under our rules, and second of all, why eventually like the minority is going to be much better under our rules. First of all, why the process of rehabilitation going to be much better under our rules? We think like the framework of the CGS itself is that also to make the perpetrators calculus to change their calculus to not do the something that are we think as a crime or prohibited by the nations, right? We think like their calculus currently are because like they are very overwhelmed by the, let's say, far right idea, for example, or the idea that are being create the harm or create violence throughout the societies, right? So that's why it is justified for them to do so. So we think what we have to do is that to go to the roots that how to make these people that even let's say your idea is right, that what you have to do is not like doing so, right? Why this is going to be much more catered by our mechanisms, right? We think like by mitigating sentence, like less prison sentence, but more, let's say, we are giving them some years or some periods in the community service, because we believe that they need some exposure, right, towards the diversity of the society, right? Because the moment, let's say, you are doing like society service, for example, you are going to be exposed towards like how another people is living, right? Because this is something that you are don't get when these people who are supporting a certain political stance that are only overwhelmed by their own people, right? Because in the end of the day, these people are incentivized to always to do like this social service in a good way. Because in the end of the day, if you are not to do so, your let's say your punishment is not going to be done in the end of the day, right? So that's why we think in the end of the day, these people are going to be exposed to do so, right? So that's why I don't think like the metrics of like another things like deterrence under their side is going to be like things or maybe like just blame them because like you are doing so, it's going to be do the deterrence. So we think like the vicious of like the vicious cycle of criminals is still going to be exist at their side, because like let's say you are going to outside of the crime, you still believe that, let's say, the government is wrong, the government is evil, because they are scrutinize your ideology, scrutinize your political expressions. That I don't think like this is correct to do that. In the end of the day, like this is still continues the vicious cycle of crimes that they are proposing in the end of the day. Right now, moving on, why this is going to be like bad for minorities in the end of the day, because the reason why, like, let's say, the most of minorities like doing riots, let's say, or maybe like there is a politician who believe that the minorities should do riots, or politician who, or let's say any activist who tells people to do riots because like to do riots because they want their right are being accommodated under the incumbency or accommodated under the system. So we think like we think in the end of the day, so that's why like let's say the law itself, the majority standard, so that's why they are less likely to be accommodated, right? So that's why we think in the end of the day, the moment like minorities doing riots for their rights, doing rally for their rights, we think like it is going to make them to be easily scrutinized or easily prosecuted, right? Because in the end of the day, under their rules is going to be harmed the more towards the vulnerable actor, because the standard of the mitigation action, there is nothing like what that you are actually influenced by the by your people who are taught you to do so, right? So that's why under their rules, we think like it's going to be very hard for, let's say, these minorities to fight for their right, because in the end of the day, your political expressions cannot be like your mitigation factors the moment like your riots is in the wrong way, right? In the end of the day, we cater the vulnerabilities, right? Because under our words, it is less chance for them to be like persecuted. So that's why we're very proud to propose.
All right, thank you for the very fine speech. To continue the debate, I call member of opposition here.
Check, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, wait a minute. If you want to POI, just open your microphone. Probably not going to look at the chat. Yeah, if I have connection issue, please just yell at me. Wait a minute. Let me set my paper and timer. Okay. Wait, sorry. I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think closing government entire case about rehabilitation and why it's going to be much better if we are going to be able to make sure that this political statement are going to be mitigating factor really won't work, right? Two reasons. One engagement, right? First, if you do not actually recognize their active decision in actually doing the criminal action or violence behavior when doing riot to begin with, you are actually not acknowledging that it is their active decision or deranged interpretation of their of this particular political actor interpretation of political statement that is getting you being punished to begin with. You're actually blaming other actor. Therefore, rehabilitation will not ever exist under closing government side of the house, because you never actually tell them what is their mistake to begin with. You're always going to put the blame of whatever they're doing on other actor. Therefore, they will never be rehabilitated. But secondly, in terms of prosecution of ideology, I don't think this is a very well thought out explanation, right? We believe that in terms of prosecution of ideology or how people are becoming very violent and etc., this won't happen simply because under our side of the house, the moment you actually punish them entirely based on their action, their criminal action, and the harm that they have been done to within this kind of riot to begin with, you're no longer persecuting them based on the ideology that they have been doing, that they believe in, but simply by their action that is wrong, right? Under your side of the house, comparatively, when you actually prosecute them and actually take into consideration and reduce their sentencing based on the ideology that they believe, this is where exactly how prosecution of ideology and how vicious cycle actually happen under government side of the house, right? So in my speech, I'm going to bring two point of explanation. First, let's actually I'm going to talk about the influence, the existence of influence. This is going to directly engage to opening government cases about the culpability of political segment, which is not being engaged by opening opposition. And secondly, I'm going to also talk about bad precedents in political field if this motion were to be true, right? But before moving on, several framework that I need to bring in this debate, right? One, prosecution in this sense means that they have done criminal action, right? Vandalism, violence, and etc. And second, political public statement will not have explicit order for you to actually destroy things or hurt anyone, right? Because most political public statement are going to have plausible deniability in terms of word that is being used and etc. Right? We believe that this is going to be very much important later on when we engage into opening government case about culpability of political statement. Third framework is that this political statement, we agree that it's very influential and we need to have certain level of accountability that is not achievable toward making sure that this political statement become a mitigating factor in criminal justice system. But fourth, we say that this we under closing opposition are going to recognize the existence of this kind of influence that is being done toward this inflammatory public statement, but we are not going to use it as a mitigating factor, and we are going to explain it later in my speech. Why is it actually important for us to actually recognize this, right? So moving to my first point, engagement are going to be integrated in my speech later on. First, let's talk about influence and why is it actually exists but not as a mitigating factor, right? One, we actually recognize that the influence of political figure making this political statement exists and is very large. But in terms of culpability of political statement, it is not really usable because most of politicians, when they tweet or when they make public statement, most of them have a good PR team. Therefore, they usually have plausible deniability. So there are two scenarios that government side of the house need to actually defend, right? One, you need to actually make generalization and assumption of what kind of interpretation that does this actually this political statement actually can be used at the end of the day. Therefore, you actually need to justify the introduction of random and subjective variable into criminal justice system that are going to break the system at the end of the day. But second scenario is that you are not going to make interpretation, you're not going to make generalization of this particular public statement. Therefore, this political statement are not culpable, it's not usable at all in the court at the end of the day, right? But second layer of influence is how this kind of recognition doesn't always mean it has to be a mitigating factor, right? Opening opposition entire case is want to deny the fact that influence exists, or opening opposition didn't want to recognize the existence of influence that this political figure actually have toward this individual, right? We say under closing opposition, it is very important for us to actually recognize this particular influence that political figure have, in terms of creating proportionality of punishment, but also the accountability for this particular individual at the end of the day. Which led me to my second point about how it's going to create bad precedents in political field, right? We believe that the moment you don't actually recognize this particular individual, you're going to create two scenarios, right? One, you're going to create a much bigger cult of personality toward this particular political figure who are most likely are going to be very inflammatory to begin with. But secondly, you're going to create incentive for this individual to be more inflammatory to begin with. Before moving on, yes, OG.
Rigidity of law rooted from a place of privilege. No opposition bench explain why law must be that rigid. The analysis of principle in OG stands.
Okay, in terms of how law exists, we believe that law need to be actually fair, and we're not talking about privilege or not privilege, but we're talking about the criminal justice system in which we need to uphold the principle of harm that is being done and the intent behind it, right? We say that it's going to create a much worse precedence in terms of how this individual are going to react within a political field, right? First layer, much bigger of cult personality. The moment you actually recognize this political statement as a mitigating factor, you're going to actually weaponize this personality to be your backer in terms of you doing much worse criminal action to begin with, right? You're going to search in Twitter of many personality that you can actually use their statement as a backing or as a base for you to actually do crime to begin with. But secondly, in terms of incentive to be more inflammatory, right? This political figure, as OJ actually said, has interest to make sure that their supporters are going to be free much faster, right? Because they are the one who actually they're the one who is actually on the ground and telling people to vote for you and etc. Right, influencing other people. Therefore, these politicians are going to be making much more inflammatory statement for their supporter to actually use as a form of mitigating factor to begin with, for them to actually get out of prison much quicker, right? So in my speech, I'm already prove to you two things, right? One, influence does exist, and it's very important for us to actually acknowledge that influence exists, but it should not be a mitigating factor. But secondly, on how it's going to also create bad precedents if we are going to use this as a mitigating factor at the end of the day. Very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you for the very fine speech. To close up the government case, I call the government whip. Here.
Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, thank you. Gender pronounce your him. If you want to POI, please through the chat box. Okay. I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panels, I think OO cannot win this debate just by saying that, oh, this kind of interpretation is not quantifiable and you cannot assume what is wrong and what is right to begin with. I think to make something as a mitigating factor, not everything should be quantifiable to begin with, right? Imagine that yourself, for example, that in the CGS itself, there are many mitigating factors that exist, for example, like mental illness or maybe stressor that exists in your side of the house that also cannot be quantifiable to begin with. I don't think why quantifiable should become the main metrics to begin with. But even if that quantifiable should become the measure, I think we can some extent do it by this motion. Like, for example, if this kind of people or group have the same dogma or belief regarding this far right policy, then they will be saying the same thing in that court and something like that, and they will be can test like how they are honest or lying to begin with. That's why it can be quantifiable or not. Also, closing opposition also cannot saying that in the very worst case that these people can just choose whatever personality that they want. I think there are no one in this world just want to be punished again and again, because remember this motion talking about mitigating factor, not erasing factor, right? So regardless how good you are changing your personality, in the end of the day you will be punished and you will get all that like jail punishment at the end of the day. Two things my speech. First, regarding justification, why it's very important, and also what are the opposition cannot win this debate. First, regarding justification. Thierry brought you a very beautiful argument regarding rehabilitation, which is a very most important regarding this debate. Remember that this debate is about a brainwashed vulnerable actor, which is the majority that exists in the US, for example, that they've been told that, oh, this is a political fraud, all the election process is a lie, and Biden win just because they do a very cunning way, for example. I think this kind of situation make this individual cannot think carefully what actually need to be done to begin with. That's why we as the government should become the very responsible actor to make sure that our people become educated and cannot do the same thing again and again in the future. That's why rehabilitation should become very prioritized. Thierry also tell to you that this rehabilitation also much better, right? Because in your side, you only will give this individual a prison, for example, for 2 or 3 years, but they never actually know what is wrong to begin with, right? Thierry brought to you regarding the community service and a very diverse social living that will make this individual realize that their belief is wrong and they should like comply with the what actually right to begin with. I'm going to extend this by explaining why we need that responsibility to begin with. Remember that this kind of riot is not only rely on this individual, right? There are a multi-layer problem that exists, like how the government is incapable to maintain the peace, or maybe also the media that's shifting the narrative and something like that. So we think that's why this responsibility should be like catered together to making this kind of situation much better. Thierry also brought to you the idea of minority, right? Like how they cannot like express their personal, like their political belief that may be very limited because like they cannot make it as a mitigating factor. This is a very important thing, because opposition never tell how this minority to begin with can cater their political belief and can like telling what they want to begin with, right? Now move on to the what CO said. CO said that in the first place, like, oh, this kind of intention will be very assumption, like it's very subjective and become a too much variable to begin with. First respond. We think if like these people are already being brainwashed enough, this kind of subjectivity can be measured also like how you can in the CGS system have your own team, for example, to determine that this person is honest or lying or not, for example. And I don't think subjectivity can become the tipping point for CO because like I said before, in the CGS itself, what is most important thing is regarding how like the punishment should be implied and how the person that after get out of the jail can understand what they're doing. So I don't think why subjectivity should become their main metrics. Also, move to the OO, right? OO telling you like 4 layer of analysis why in the end of the day this is the problem of the prosecutor itself. First, regarding agency, right? I will tell you why agency never exists to begin with. First, talking about their analogy, like they said that political cannot kill your own family, for example. You have an opt-out mechanism. No, we don't think this exists to begin with. Remember that politician is a very important and big figure. For example, if Donald Trump brainwashed these people by saying if Joe Biden get elected, then your business will be fall down, your family cannot eat anymore, or maybe the education system will be erased in the US system. I think this kind of harm more severe under the political figure itself and make your agency losing to begin with, right? Remember yourself, for example, your will be get all the terror from this Donald Trump to begin with, that they say that it will affect all your business sector, how you're going to live, and how you cannot do so many right to begin with. I think this at some extent more harmful regarding like the very like how the personal killer and something like that very limited harm that they can impose. Secondly, they broke about like this individual don't understand what they're doing. They broke the analogy of hypnotize and drugs. I don't think that's also important. Like these people is brainwashed to begin with, right? They never know like what is actually true or not because they live in a terror of like what will happen in the future at the end of the day. That's why these people can get easier like doing what they feel is right to begin with based on what the news or what the majority tell at the end of the day.
Yeah, we frame out rehabilitation by arguing that principle is more important, which CO repeated. But if your point is totally brainwashed derivative from OG, we posit that the politician will also be punished. What's the harm?
So I explained to you the harm that going to be accessed, which is much more important, is regarding the rehabilitation itself. Like how this individual that in yourself the house never been corrected regarding their belief and how it can be like become their main rehabilitation itself to become a better functional individual in the society itself. I think it's more important. And also your analysis regarding how this individual is having an agency and they can also knowing what is wrong is right is never been true to begin with, right? Lastly, they explaining to you that what is wrong is if it based on the majority itself. I think it cannot be like apple to apple comparison. Like for example, maybe there are some place in the US that is a very educated regarding political belief, but there is also another place that have a very less educated political belief. I think this is why you cannot just compare that if there are like 10 states agree that this is a brainwash, then this is can be a mitigating factor. I think there are a very diverse background from this individual to begin with, and that's why you cannot generalizing that all people should be doing the same, so that can be like counted as the mitigating factor. I think that's why CG win this debate, right? Because we're explaining to you that why rehabilitation is very important thing, and also why OO analysis regarding like these people have agency and these people also knowing what they can do never been true to begin with, and why CO analysis regarding that people can change personality is a very worst case scenario, and how in the end of the day why if they still doing that they will get the punishment at the end of the day. Very proud to propose.
All right, thank you for the very fine speech. To close up the debate, I call up Web. Here.
Check, I'm audible.
Yes, you're audible.
Wait. The background is too formal. Dah. PI preference through chat. Okay. Preference to chat, gender preference he or him. Please don't just raise your hand because I can't see the color thingy handy. I'm going to start my speech in. Okay, I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Two spectrum to assess this debate, right? First, through law, parameter itself, and second, through the politics. What do I mean? I mean, at first, to assess the mechanism that we could do, we need to assess how does the law work and why does it exist in the first place, and how the impact that it's going to make in the politic world, and how it could create betterment at the end of the day. Now, one burden that is exclusively towards our governments of the House, which have never been engaged and never been explained. And that is exactly the spirit of the motion. That is by explaining what is the exclusivity on the politician itself. Why is it exclusive for them? That this kind of inflammatory public statement is exclusive only by the words that is influenced by this kind of politician. Because basically, every human rights have this, every citizen have the same rights, right? Because that is basically what the law really wanted. That is for the equality of rights itself. The moment that you are going to put it is exclusive towards the politician itself, what does the harm that is going to create? Why does this exclusive towards them, and how is it going to create betterment in the society? And why does the politician have bigger obligation, and why is it justified for us to do so? This has never been explained by the governments of the House. The moment they never explain these kind of things, they should lost in this debate. Now, one reason why the closing government is better, closing opposition is better than the opening opposition. Opening opposition came to debate with the practicality of law, right? Basically explaining half of the spectrum of the penal law itself. In the penal law itself, we know about how there is not only actus reus, it's not only mens rea itself, but also actus reus. What do I mean? What I mean is the moment the opening opposition came to this debate, only talking about mens rea, or the people that is going to only do things itself, they will always exist. But the most important things, the most crucial things in the penal law itself is the actus reus, or the things that they are going to do. Why so? Because basically without actus reus, there is nothing to do and there's nothing to punish in the penal law itself, because the goal of the penal law is to create certainty in the law itself. Therefore, there is no people that is going to play the law and use it as their own personal power itself. This is the exact reason about how without this kind of explanation, there is no urgency in why does the law have to be so certain, because about how law certainty is so important. What will happen in the opposition governments of the House without these kind of things? Basically, what they wanted to do is there is no law certainty and some kind of and speciality in this kind of politician people. Therefore, you are not going to basically follow the rules of the law itself. You are going to create uncertainty. You are going to make people who basically you are trying to say about how they are so exclusive, or the one who have or the elitist one, to basically can play the law the moment that they want to do things. Basic example is like this: the moment that there is an incumbent or someone in the government that is strong enough that wanted to do a riot and they want to use the society to protest it, they just simply say that you will be penalized decreasely, because of how during the sentencing there is a mitigating factor by this kind of politician. But at the same time, we also see about how this kind of politician also have a political immunity, where everything they say during their kind of their kind of term is they cannot be penalized. We say this is a kind of how the whole governments of the House are going to play the law itself. They are going to create even more and bigger disturbance in the law itself. We say in practicality of law, the closing opposition actually explain to you better about how it is very extreme the moment that you are going to do these kind of things, about how, and basically linking back towards the principle of law about how actus reus, or the things that you are going to do, is so important itself, because basically that is what the law have to seek, right? So basically three clashes that I'm going to bring in this debate, three engagement that I'm going to bring towards the closing government. Closing government came into this debate. They came into this debate talking about how at the end of the day, what they wanted is, first, they want a better rehabilitation. Second of all, about how they want to create a better justice towards the minority. And third of all, what they really wanted is how at the end of the day, these two kind of things could ensure justice that they really wanted at the end of the day. First of all, first responses towards which side of the House give a better practicality or give a better benefit towards minority. In the oppositions of the governments of the House, what they are going to do is basically going to make a minority as a tool for this kind of politician to use, about how they are not going to create any good political will, about how at the end of the day, this kind of people could only be the tool for this kind of people, this kind of elitists. But let's assume what happens in their side of the House, even if they are going about how that this kind of things already bad enough for a bad the current system is already bad enough for minority. First of all, we say no. Why? Because the current system, the moment that this kind of people do riots, it's not because they really wanted to do. It's not because they are being forced, right? They are basically do it because they really wanted to. Even though there is going to be some words coming from this popular media or this kind of politicians saying that some system is screwed, it's basically their own choice whether or not they wanted to do. We say freedom of right still exists in their side of the and even in their side of the house when this kind of thing doesn't happen. Right? We say it's still justified. But let's assume about how that this kind of minority actually it's really bad about how at the end of the day they will be the one who is sentenced. Exactly on that point, this is what the closing opposition really wanted, right? The deterrence that they stated that they really wanted to achieve will only be achieved in our side of the house the moment that they see that law is actually so fixed and you can't play with it and you can scrutinize it. The moment they see what how the law is so rigid, that's how they will follow the law, and they will rather follow the law and follow the rules that already exist rather than follow about how the politician that is trying to scrutinize them. We say about how we are helping them with we are helping them by giving them the better risk that will happen in their side of the house. We say we won the clash of who is better for minority. Second clash is about how we side of the house it could create better rehabilitation at the end of the day, right? Better rehabilitation could only exist the moment that you're not going to play with the law. You are going to let you are going to let the society know what is going to control them and how it's going to create betterment in the society. What happens in the governments of the house, they're going to create a more bigger model, but how, for example, the moment that this kind of people do riots, but they doesn't have any justification, they will simply say about how there is a tweet coming from a politician simply because there is no parameter about how and what is inflammatory public statements. We say all the argument coming from the closing government should be debunked. Now let's come into my little engagement towards the opening government. Basically, let's just throw away the whole opening government badge. Why so? Because opening government arguments, they relies on solving problem and recognizing by mitigating, right? There is the problem. The moment that you can mitigate, what will happen is how in the side of the house, it will be very likely for this kind of politician to be for this kind of people to be washed, and how it's so easy because basically no people are being mitigated. We are saying about how in the opening government, all of the betterment that they're trying to say about how that all things are already basically already known. Therefore, you don't need to create any different changes or differences in the society right now. And that's the reason to oppose.
All right. Thank you for the great debate. I would like to make everyone just leave the room and just stay in the main room for the announcement for the panels. Let's go to breakout room. Ada nggak ya? Oh, nggak ada. Let's just stay here. Okay, thank you everyone. Okay, is the room clear now?
Belum, and also kayaknya we need to stop recording as well deh.
Oh, okay, yeah.